Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z Flashback, a series of explorations of the 150 games that make up Atari Flashback Classics for Nintendo Switch. Today's game is Skydiver for Atari 2600. The original arcade version of Skydiver was developed by Owen Rubin for arcades and released in 1978, and indeed we've previously seen this version on Atari A to Z Flashback. The Atari 2600 version followed a year later and was handled by Jim Huther. This version was mostly true to the arcade original in terms of mechanics, but it placed a stronger focus on two-player competitive action with a selection of game variations. The one thing the home version of Skydiver lacks is the pinball-inspired function of the original arcade machine that allowed you to light up letters on the arcade cabinet and obtain bonuses. Owen Rubin was a big fan of pinball and had to fight to get this included in the arcade original, but it certainly provided a fun risk versus reward mechanic to the original game. The Atari 2600 version counters the lack of this with a variety of different game variations, such as moving platforms to land on and a mode where only the first of the two players to land scores any points. So, let's go play Skydiver.
Okay, welcome back once again to Atari Flashback Classics, where today's game is Skydiver. This is a game you can play with one or two players. Technically it's a two-player only game, but you can play it by yourself. I'm going to recruit my wife to play it two-player as intended, so shortly I will hand over to Future Pete to commentate on that action. But first, before we do that, we'll take our usual look at the manual and what it has to tell us. So let's dive in. Lovely bit of artwork there. I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Lovely shot of a parachutist's crotch. Very nice. Okay, use your joystick controllers with this Atari game program, blah 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 blah. Your initial task is to guide the Skydiver TM onto the landing pad. Your ultimate task is to score more points than your opponent. To hit the landing pad and score points, you must release the Skydiver from the airplane, open the parachute, control the downward drift of the Skydiver, and land squarely on the pad at the bottom of the screen. So, in terms of concept, this is exactly the same as the arcade version. It's just presented in glorious 2600 vision. There are 5 two-player games in Skydiver. You and your opponent have 9 jumps each in which to score points. So this aspect is a little bit different. In the original arcade version of Skydiver, you could miss 3 times, but you otherwise played as long as possible. And you could get bonuses and extra misses by lighting up the Skydiver letters at the bottom of the screen. In this, you just have 9 jumps each to score points, and whoever gets the most points wins. You must contend with a varying wind factor during each jump, except in games 3 and 4. Blind to numbers, apparently. The wind sock at the bottom center of the screen indicates the direction and the speed of the wind. If the sock is pointing to the right, the wind is blowing to the right, and conversely for the left. If the sock is hanging loosely, the wind speed is slower than when the sock is flying rigidly and taut. The wind factor changes between jumps and may vary slightly during a jump. Okay, so controls in this are pretty simple. You press the red button on the controller, or just the button in the Switch version, the A button, to release the Skydiver from the plane. Pull back on the joystick to open the parachute, and then move left and right to steer against the wind. So as in the arcade version, you get more points the later you open your parachute. So you can score between 0 and 11 points in this. So the numbers are a bit smaller than the original arcade version. There is a point at the bottom of the descent where the parachute can no longer be opened, so you can't leave it too late. If the Skydiver hits the ground with an unopened chute, you lose 4 points. So this is how it gets around the fact that you don't have a limit in the number of misses you can do in this one. You just get penalised the number of points if you mess up. Maximum score is 99. Right and left scores represent the right and left players respectively. Beginning players should start with the difficulty switch in the B position. In the A position, the planes fly significantly faster across the screen, thereby increasing the difficulty. Okay, games 1 and 2 are identical with one exception. In game 2, the width of each landing pad is smaller, making it more difficult to score points. The landing pads are placed in different spots for each jump. In games 3 and 4, the landing pads move back and forth. There is no wind factor. The landing pads in game 4 are smaller in width. And play chicken in game 5 with your opponent. There's only one landing pad in the middle of the screen. The first player to land squarely on the pad scores points. The other player receives no points for that jump. And that's it. So it's a pretty straightforward and simple game. But I can see this being a lot of fun. I haven't actually tried this version yet. I've played the arcade version quite a bit as I record this, and I think I talked a bit about that during the playthrough of that arcade version, that it actually proved surprisingly popular among my friends when I busted out Atari Flashback Classics for the last instalment of the Davison Cup, which we've not been able to do for the last few years, unfortunately. But yeah, one day we'll get it back again. But yeah, anyway, Skydiver proved surprisingly popular with people in its arcade incarnation, so I can see the 2600 version being an enjoyable two-player game as well, particularly as it's so simple. It's very easy to teach someone, and that makes for a good two-player game where you're both on a relatively even playing field to begin with. So we'll just see how that goes. I will hand over to Future Pete now, and well, you'll just have to see how Future Pete and Future Pete's wife, who is also my wife, get on with that. So I'll hand over to him right now.
Okay, Future Pete here. Now we're playing some Skydiver. I am the green planes on the left, and my wife is the red plane on the right. So, as we've seen in the manual, the way this game works is that you leap out the plane by pressing the fire button on your controller, and then you pull back on your joystick like you're pulling a ripcord to open your parachute. And the later you open your parachute, the more points you get. But if you open your parachute too late, or rather attempt to open your parachute too late, it won't open at all. This is something my wife found herself struggling with a little bit. Because the sprites move quite quickly on this one, partly due to the fact that it's running at much lower resolution than the arcade version, you have to be very quick to respond to what's going on. And that's a bit of an adjustment if you're used to the arcade version. And if you're new to the game as well, it actually makes it quite difficult and quite challenging. So that's something that we both struggled with at times. But my wife found it a particular challenge for some reason. You can see at times she was just not opening the parachute at all. She also found it quite confusing that you had to push down to open your parachute. Now, I pointed out that it's probably supposed to simulate the idea of pulling a ripcord down, but she's more used to games where you sort of push in a direction that corresponds to what your character's going to do. So she thought that pushing up might make more sense because you're slowing your character's descent. I can see a point on that, but I mean it's just something you have to sort of get used to, and she did gradually get used to that fact over the course of our play session. But yeah, she found that a bit of a struggle to begin with. Yes, a few things you'll notice as we're playing this. One is the windsock in the middle, which can gradually change throughout the course of a single jump. And secondly, the number in the lower left, that's how many jumps you have left before the game's over. So like I said in the intro, before in the arcade version, we saw that you had a limited number of misses. So you could miss the pad a number of times, or you could fail to jump a number of times, but otherwise you could keep playing for as long as you wanted, as long as you were sort of fulfilling the conditions of the game. This version of the game has a hard cap on how long you can play for. So you can just have a certain number of jumps, and then the game's over, and then whoever has the most points wins. That helps sort of get around a potential issue from the arcade version in two-player, where if one player is out early, the other player then has to sort of play by themselves. So in theory, I guess it makes it more fair, because everyone has the same number of chances to score points. But at the same time, if you mess up too many times towards the beginning of the play session, you'll find yourself struggling to catch up, particularly if the other person has been scoring lots of points. So this variation we're playing here, this is the second variation, where it's the same as the first. So you jump out the plane, open your parachute, try and land on the pad. The only difference here is that the landing pad is smaller. So it's a little bit more challenging, but otherwise it's the exact same game.
Now, over the course of our play session, I was starting to get a slightly better feel for how this works and how to sort of time jumping out the plane is probably one of the most important things in the game. So in order to time that correctly, you need to keep an eye on the wind at the bottom and jump out the plane at a time that sort of corresponds to how much wind there is. So if the wind is pointing to the left, for example, in my case anyway, because my plane's flying left, you need to jump a little bit earlier. And if it's pointing to the right, you need to jump a little bit later. So here we are having another go at the small platform version. You also notice that the game is quite picky about you landing on the pad. If you remember the arcade version was pretty lenient in terms of detecting whether you landed on the pad. You pretty much only needed 1 foot on the pad a little bit in order to score the points. Whereas in this one, it's very picky about both feet of your sprite being within the area covered by the landing pad. You see there, my left foot is not touching the pad, so I don't get any points. And you'll see that in some cases that can be like even by a pixel. It can be out and you won't score any points. That can be a little bit frustrating at times. But you soon get used to it. And again, because of the low resolution of the game compared to the arcade version, 1 pixel is a fairly significant distance on the screen. And you'll also see there that my left foot is it's still touching the pad, but it's poking out the side by 1. So there's leniency in that regard, but not in terms of sort of having 1 foot on the pad and the other one on the dirt. But yeah, I found myself sort of gradually getting to grips with the mechanics of this. And my wife was doing a bit better as well. You see, she won that game there. She wasn't having a lovely time, I must confess. At several points during the session, she asked me to quote the fact that she said that this game is stupid. This game is stupid. I mean, I kind of like this game for the fact that it is stupid. It is so simple. It is so simple and so straightforward. So it's quite accessible. I don't think it's quite as accessible as something like Canyon Bomber, which I think is kind of my benchmark for accessibility in old Atari games, because Canyon Bomber is literally 1 button. You press 1 button to drop bombs. And like in both the arcade version and the 2600 version, that's all you need to know how to do. So anyway, we're now playing the moving platforms variant, which, as you can see, is considerably more difficult. But it does have the nice touch of if you actually land on the platform correctly, your little dude gets carried along by the platform, which is nice. Now, to make this a little bit easier, because obviously it's inherently much more difficult by the fact that the platform is moving, there's no wind in this mode. So this is all about timing. It's all about timing your jump out the plane, timing the opening of your parachute, and timing your movement once your parachute is open so that you'll actually land on the platform. And again, it's all about watching your target and hitting that button at the right time. It's something that will sort of become reasonably instinctive after a little while, I'd say. So by a few times into this game, I wasn't sort of consciously thinking about what I should be doing, but I kind of had an instinctive understanding of what was the right timing, what was the right relative position of my plane and the platform to make it work. And you see, it still didn't always work. And again, there's my wife struggling, inadvertently landing on my platform and making a little 3D pixel man in the process. But yeah, I found this mode quite fun, but this is obviously even less accessible than the basic mode, because there's a lot of challenge factor there. But it is satisfying when you get it right. It is enjoyable. This is one thing I like about this game, because it's so straightforward, but there's a challenge element to those mechanics. It is very satisfying when you figure out how to do it properly and you score some points, particularly if you manage to leave opening the parachute a little bit later and score a lot of points. So now we're on to game variation 4, which is the same as what we've just seen, but it has small moving platforms, so even more difficult. I must confess my wife was not all that enamoured with the idea of playing with small moving platforms, because she'd already found the moving platforms quite a challenge. And we both suspected that this was going to be a 0-point game, but eventually we did both figure out how to land on these narrow platforms. It's not easy, but again, it's just all about the timing and the positioning. See, there we are, there's 7 points for me. It's just all about timing that jump out of the plane and then positioning yourself properly while you're opening your parachute and descending to the ground. And once you get into a rhythm, it becomes reasonably straightforward. And so once you spot that pattern, it becomes almost instinctive. So you know exactly, right, the platform's moving that way, my plane's here, I'm going to jump now, and that will stand me in the best possible position to actually land on the platform. So it wasn't a completely clean sweep for me in this one. I got 28, my wife has got 2, but she didn't actually have nothing, which was good. And then finally we move on to the last game variation, which is called Chicken. Now in this one there's only one platform in the middle, and whoever lands on it first gets the points. Other than that, the scoring is the same. There's wind in this one again because the platform isn't moving. And the slight twist on the formula is that both the planes are moving much more quickly. Now you see, this is mostly all about who jumps out of the plane first, but at the same time it's also about who opens their parachute last as well, because even if you jump out of the plane after someone else, if you open your parachute a little bit later, you can actually overtake them in mid-air. And you'll see that happen a couple of times throughout the course of this game. My wife just giving up in frustration there, just flinging herself into the abyss. But there we are. So she came out first that time and comfortably landed and got the points. So again, it's about timing, but it's not just about who jumps out of the plane first, because there is at least one jump in this sequence you'll see where I jumped out second and still managed to get the points because I opened my parachute a little bit later and overtook her in mid-air. Very close, that one. Very close, but I just had it in the bag. So one will go for me and my wife on this chicken mode, and this will take us to the end of our session. So again, another comfortable win for me there. 5 points though. Oh, just 1 pixel in it for me there. So my wife just gave up and decided to go somewhere else. There again. So all about timing, not only the jump out of the plane, but also the opening of the parachute. Now that one there, she didn't land with both feet on the pad, so I still got the points, even though I landed second. So this mode's fun, but it can be a bit frustrating, and it's probably best. So see there's an example of me opening the parachute later and being able to overtake her, and she found that very annoying. that caused another utterance of "This game is stupid," and yeah, there you go. Another suicidal fling there, and on to our last jump. And a comfortable victory for me. 40-0. So yeah, that is Skydiver. The 5 different game variations you've got on there. It's a good adaptation of the arcade game, but it's like I say, because of the nature of its mechanics, I don't think it's quite as accessible as some other stuff like Canyon Bomber. But I had fun, and I think my wife had a reasonable amount of fun as well, despite thinking that the game is stupid. But there you go. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.